In 1954, Simca outsold Renault on French roads. A decade on, that name had vanished completely. Chrysler didn't rescue this automaker. It arrived with a very different plan in mind. Court filings and internal memos, uncovered decades afterward, point toward something closer to a deliberate takedown. No natural decline explains what happened here. Call it a paper trail of erasure, built one document at a time. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop your country below, then stick with us, because what those archives reveal next changes everything you think you know about Simca. Nanterre, 1934. A young Italian immigrant named Henri Pigozzi stood inside a half-empty factory, one he'd just convinced Fiat to lend him. Records from that period show Pigozzi negotiating something unusual: exclusive rights to assemble Fiat designs on French soil, under a French name, sold to French buyers. Turin supplied the blueprints. Nanterre supplied the labor. Between those two cities, a new automaker took shape almost overnight. Société Industrielle de Mécanique et Carrosserie Automobile. That mouthful of a name got shortened fast, first to Simca, then simply Simca. Buyers didn't need to understand the acronym. They just needed a car they could afford, built close to home, backed by an engineering pedigree Fiat had spent decades earning in Italy. Success came quicker than anyone at Fiat expected. By the late 1930s, Simca's early models were outselling several established French marques on their own turf. War interrupted that momentum entirely, flattening factories and freezing production across the country. What survived the occupation, though, was something harder to destroy than steel or tooling: a customer base that still trusted the name. Post-war France needed cars badly, and it needed foreign currency even more urgently. Government policy at the time pushed manufacturers hard toward exports, rationing steel allocations based partly on how much a company could sell abroad. Simca, still leaning on its Fiat-derived engineering, adapted quickly to that pressure. Fresh models rolled out of a newly expanded plant in Poissy, built specifically to handle volume the Nanterre site could never manage alone. The Aronde arrived in 1951, and it changed Simca's entire trajectory. Unibody construction, modern styling, a genuinely French identity stepped fully out from under Fiat's shadow for the first time. Company archives from this period describe sales figures that stunned even Pigozzi's own board. Within 3 years, Simca had overtaken Renault in total French sales, a milestone practically nobody outside the company had predicted at the decade's start. Here's what those archives also reveal, quietly buried beneath the celebration. Growth at that pace demands capital, and Simca's balance sheet couldn't generate enough of it internally. Expansion into new markets, new tooling for updated models, new dealership networks across Europe, all of it required investment far beyond what post-war French banks were willing or able to provide alone. Pigozzi understood the problem clearly enough. He needed a partner with deep pockets and no interest in swallowing the company whole. Fiat itself couldn't fill that role anymore. Regulatory pressure in France discouraged too much foreign ownership concentrated in one place. So Pigozzi went looking elsewhere. And by the mid-1950s, he'd found an American company eager to expand its footprint across Europe. Chrysler bought its first minority stake in Simca in 1958. On paper, the arrangement looked almost ideal for both sides. Chrysler gained a foothold in a growing European market without building a single new factory. Simca gained capital, technical resources, and a partner large enough to fund the expansion Pigozzi had been chasing for years. Board minutes from that period, later reviewed by historians, describe genuine optimism inside Simca's leadership. Nobody recorded any serious concern about long-term control shifting away from French hands. The deal, as written, kept Chrysler's stake safely below a majority threshold, a detail Pigozzi's team treated as sufficient protection. That confidence wouldn't survive the next decade. Documents uncovered later paint a very different picture of what Chrysler had actually planned from the very beginning, one that had nothing to do with simply funding a promising French partner. Detroit executives reviewed that 1958 agreement with a very different set of priorities than Pigozzi's own board back in France. Internal Chrysler correspondence, surfaced decades later through corporate archives, reveals a company thinking well past a simple minority partnership. Europe represented growth Chrysler couldn't find at home, and Simca offered a fast, proven entry point into that market. Stakes crept upwards steadily through the early 1960s. What began as a modest financial position expanded year after year, each increase justified internally as routine investment, rather than a calculated march toward control. Nobody at Simca's Paris headquarters raised serious alarm, at least not according to surviving board records. Chrysler's growing ownership still technically fell short of a majority, and that single number kept French executives comfortably reassured. Numbers alone, though, rarely tell the full story. Voting rights attached to Chrysler's shares carried more practical weight than raw percentages suggested, especially once American representatives began occupying key positions on Simca's own board. Decisions that once ran through Peugeot's office in Nanterre increasingly required sign-off from Detroit instead, a shift subtle enough that few outside the boardroom noticed it happening in real time. Peugeot himself grew increasingly sidelined throughout this period. He'd built Simca from a half-empty factory into France's second-largest automaker, yet found himself answering to executives who'd never set foot in Poissy before the deal closed. Health problems compounded that frustration. By 1963, illness had removed him from daily operations almost entirely, leaving Chrysler's representatives with an even freer hand inside the company he'd founded. If you're finding this story worth your time, hitting subscribe helps more people discover how a great automaker actually disappears, quietly, one boardroom vote at a time. Formal control arrived in 1963, when Chrysler finally crossed the threshold into majority ownership. French regulators reviewed the acquisition and approved it, treating the move largely as a formality, given how much ground had already shifted years earlier. Newspapers covered the announcement briefly, framing it as continued American investment in French manufacturing rather than anything resembling a takeover. Behind that framing sat a much less comfortable reality. Chrysler now controlled product decisions, factory investment, and export strategy for a company that had spent 30 years building genuine French identity into every model it produced. Engineers who designed the Arande now worked under management structures dictated from Michigan, adapting to priorities that didn't always align with what French buyers actually wanted from their cars. Small signals appeared first, easy to dismiss individually. Badging on new models started incorporating Chrysler's own design language alongside Simca's traditional markings. Export strategy shifted noticeably toward American tastes, sometimes at the expense of models that had performed well domestically for years. Dealership training materials, once written entirely in French with French market context, began arriving with American terminology mixed in. None of these changes triggered public alarm on their own. Together, though, they traced a clear trajectory that Simca's remaining French executives could see forming, even if they lacked the leverage to stop it. Peugeot's illness worsened through 1964, removing the one voice inside the company who might have pushed back against Detroit's growing influence. He died in November of that year, and with him went the last meaningful resistance to Chrysler's full authority over the company he'd founded 3 decades earlier. What happened next moved considerably faster than anything that preceded it. Documents from this period describe internal discussions about consolidating the Simca name entirely under Chrysler's own European branding, a conversation that had apparently been building quietly for longer than anyone outside Detroit's boardroom realized. That badge, appearing smaller with each passing model year, was about to disappear entirely. And what Chrysler did next would make the previous 6 years look almost gentle by comparison. Paris, 1970. Chrysler announced the decision its own internal memos had been quietly building toward for years. The Simca name would fold entirely into Chrysler Europe's unified branding strategy. Cars that once carried 36 years of French engineering heritage would soon wear an American badge instead, sold under a single continental identity designed in Detroit boardrooms far removed from Poissy's assembly lines. Company records from this transition describe a corporate logic that had almost nothing to do with the cars themselves. Chrysler executives viewed European operations as one interchangeable network, not a collection of distinct national identities worth preserving. Simca, roots in Britain, and other European acquisitions were treated less like separate automakers with their own histories and more like factory assets awaiting standardization under a shared corporate umbrella. Standardization proceeded in stages through the early 1970s. Sunbeam names disappeared. Hillman badges vanished. Simca held on slightly longer than its British counterparts, but by 1977, even that resistance ended. Every remaining model carried the Chrysler badge outright. French engineering heritage reduced to a footnote buried somewhere inside internal parts catalogs nobody outside the company ever saw. Employees at Peugeot watched this unfold with a specific kind of professional whiplash. Engineers who'd spent careers building cars for French buyers found themselves producing vehicles branded for an American parent company with little interest in celebrating what those cars represented. This wasn't personal betrayal exactly. Company memos suggest something closer to indifference, a much colder problem for a workforce that had built real pride into every model rolling off that line. Financial trouble arrived faster than anyone at Chrysler's Detroit headquarters had planned for. America's own auto industry hit serious turbulence through the mid-1970s. Oil shocks and shifting consumer demand squeezing profit margins across every Chrysler division worldwide. European operations, expensive to maintain and increasingly unprofitable on their own, stopped looking like a strategic asset and started looking like a liability nobody in Michigan wanted to keep funding. By 1978, Chrysler made a decision that revealed exactly how disposable European operations had become inside their broader corporate thinking. The entire European division, including everything built under the Simca name, sold to Peugeot for roughly $1 plus assumed debt. That number alone tells you what 4 decades of French engineering heritage had come to represent on a Detroit balance sheet. Essentially nothing, once the parent company needed cash elsewhere. Peugeot inherited factories, workers, and a badge already stripped of its original identity years earlier. Rather than reviving Simca's name, PSA's leadership chose a different path entirely. Every remaining model got rebranded once again, this time under a resurrected name from decades earlier, Talbot. Simca, already buried under Chrysler's branding for years, never got the chance to re-emerge under its own identity at all. Nobody at Chrysler ever set out specifically to destroy Simca. That's the detail company records make painfully clear. Destruction would suggest a level of attention the brand simply never received once American priorities took over. What actually happened looks colder than deliberate sabotage. A successful French automaker, treated purely as interchangeable industrial capacity, discarded the moment it stopped serving someone else's balance sheet. Talbot itself limped through the 1980s before vanishing for good, taking whatever remained of Simca's original engineering lineage down with it. Peugeot's factory still stands today, producing cars under yet another owner's badge, its walls holding no visible trace of the company Peugeot built there from nothing. One detail sits buried deeper than most historians ever mention, and it explains exactly why nobody at Chrysler ever felt obligated to preserve what they'd acquired. That buried detail, Chrysler's own files never listed Simca as a brand worth saving, only as tooling and floor space. Peugeot still builds cars today, under a badge that isn't French, isn't American, isn't Simca. Tell me which company got treated the same way, and I'll dig up their records next.